I remember a moment clearly from my sophomore year in college. An acquaintance asked me who I was working with on a school project. I pointed him out across the room. He's standing over there near that giant window. Well, where? She said. There's a couple guys over there. He's the one in the, near that plant right there. Well, which guy? He's wearing a yellow shirt. Oh, she said. Well, why don't you just say the black dude? I told her I didn't know, but the truth was, I didn't know I was allowed to. See, the acquaintance I was talking to is a black woman, and you may have noticed, I am a white woman. And like many white people, I grew up believing that I wasn't supposed to talk about or name the race of somebody who looked different from me. Today, I also happen to be a teacher. And I come from a long line of teachers. My grandmother was a teacher. My mother was a teacher. I've got aunts, uncles, and cousins who are and still are teachers. You could say it's in my blood to be a teacher and to be white. And I'm not alone. 80% of educators in the United States are white, and the vast majority of those are women, which isn't an accident because the educational profession was set up to draw white women into it. And so we might be wondering, what do all of us white educators do with this? Because along with this history of white people coming into the profession is a history in which black and brown students were systematically deprived of adequate educational opportunities. Native Americans were removed from their homes and brought to boarding schools to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. Black and brown students were given separate but equal, but not really equal, school accommodations with lower budgets, less supplies, and less opportunities for success. And various attempts at school integration around the country resulted in violent opposition from white people as close to home as South Boston. And while we'd like to think that this history of racism is in the past, the truth is, its legacy is still very much with us today. So, as I asked before, what do we as white educators do about this? Well, we've had some ideas. We will create no excuses classrooms. We'll enforce high rigorous standards. We'll close the achievement gap by raising standardized test scores, and we'll prepare all students to attend college. But these aren't enough, because none of these solutions talk about the fact that the challenges many of our students are facing are the result of years of institutional racism directed onto them by people who look a lot like me. In my career, I've had the privilege of working in 3 different kinds of schools. My first school served mostly white students, my second school served students of color, and my current school is a mix with about 40% students of color and a population of ELL students and Brazilian students. My second year of teaching, in my mostly white school, we were in the middle of a middle school unit on civil rights. And we were having discussions about power and privilege and positions and who occupied those in our country. The question of if there were a lot of women in color in these positions came up. One of my students raised their hand and said, well, Condoleezza Rice is a woman in power. And another student, is a black woman in power. And another student immediately shot his hand into the air, didn't wait to be called on, and said, you can't say that, that's racist. But was it? Or is this student believing, just like I once had, that even mentioning the race of someone who doesn't look like you is rude or even racist? That year, my students and I went on a journey. We dug in to really explore what was racist and what wasn't racist. We asked some really hard questions. What's the cost of ignoring our cultural differences and our backgrounds and our racial identities? And what could we be gaining from embracing those? But some of the deepest work came when we read together Peggy McIntosh's article on the invisible knapsack of privilege. This is a list that she came up with when she realized she had a lot of privileges as a white woman that she didn't know she had until she started comparing notes with friends of hers who were people of color. Things like not being followed around when you're in a department store, or seeing people who reflect what you look like in movies, textbooks, and children's stories. The one that stood out to my students the most, however, was that Band-Aids are produced to match white people's skin tone. Small but powerful. And doing this work with them made me see this problem in a whole different way as well. It made me realize that one of the biggest privileges that I have as a white woman is that I can choose to think or not think about my racial identity whenever I want to. See, racial inequality doesn't happen in a vacuum. And it's not just the responsibility of marginalized groups to fight for and demand back the rights that they deserve in the first place. We as white people play a critical role in this work as well. And as teachers, even more so. Because our students are probably experiencing moments every single day worse than not being able to find a Band-Aid that matches their skin. And the sad truth is, it's possible that we're the ones that could be creating some of these moments. So what does this mean we have to do? We have to accept that our identities as white educators play a critical, crucial role in what we see, what we say, and what we teach. When I first got to my current school about 3 years ago, I started thinking about all the conversations I was looking forward to having. We had a lot of white teachers and this diverse student body that I talked about earlier. But what I noticed was that the teachers that I was working with seemed unsure of their place in these conversations. A lot of people would express worries like, well, it feels like it might be racist to talk about race or racism in the classroom, or it's just too political right now, we can't bring that up in class, or even, I don't see the race of my students, I just see them all as my students. But I also heard people say things like, we know that this is really important and we want to be able to talk about it. And I think that this is the work. And in order to talk about it, we have to bravely examine our identities, our biases, and our blind spots, because it's only then that we can start to talk about these things. So I got together with some colleagues who were also thinking about this and were wanting to tackle this problem. We started pretty small with just some afternoon sessions every other month or so, where we would look at things like, what biases did we have? Where were our blind spots? What microaggressions might we already be committing that we weren't even aware of? And eventually we were able to bring in an outside organization called the Anti-Racism Collaborative, and they came in and held a 6-week evening session that about 15 to 20 teachers took, including my executive director. At the end of this time, I said to her, we have to be bringing this work to our full faculty. How can we do this? And she helped me set up a small action committee to plan and start to implement some faculty training just around these topics. And so as we started doing this work, we asked those critical questions about our biases and our blind spots. We looked at our curriculums and thought about whose voices are we hearing and whose voices might be left out? What messages are we sending and who are we representing? And we thought about how comfortable were we having conversations around critical issues of race and racism with our students? And what work did we need to do to get there? And eventually some subtle shifts started taking place. Science teachers were talking more about scientists of color and women who had made tremendous impacts in their fields. Humanities classroom libraries were becoming even more diverse and representing more of the students in our building and buildings around the country. Faculty were having more conversations with students about their backgrounds, their identities, their cultures, their languages, and their foods. And faculty were getting more comfortable with each other, questioning things that we had taken for granted before. So if you're a white educator like me, and you're looking to find your place in this conversation, there are 3 places you can start. Look, listen, and talk. First, look. You have to first start by closely looking at your own identity, your racial identity, and your background and your culture. What have you been taught to believe? And then you need to look at what your biases might be and what blind spots you might have because of it. And start to see where those show up in your classroom and your curriculum. Second, listen. Listen to your students. Listen to people who are doing this work in the field. Listen to people of color. But be careful not to expect them to do the work for us, because that's our emotional work to do as white people. And finally, talk. Talk to your colleagues. Talk to your students. Talk to your friends and your family. Talk to your dog. Break the silence around race and racism that we've all been taught to embrace. It might be uncomfortable. It might be difficult. You might say the wrong thing. You'll probably say the wrong thing. But the truth is, we can't solve a problem we can't name. So I know that this work isn't going to solve years of institutional racism, but I can say for sure that it's turned up the dial on the comfort level that the faculty that I work with has in naming and talking about our own biases and our own identities and the role that those play in the classroom. We all know that teaching is a constant juggling of multiple priorities. Thinking about my role as a white educator in combating racism is a priority that I'm choosing to hold on to. And I invite you to choose it too.